You've probably heard a lot about generations, what they lack, what they ruined, what they don't understand, and if you're Gen X, you've likely heard almost nothing at all. No applause, no spotlight, no constant validation. But what if that wasn't neglect? What if it was training? What if the very thing that made your life quieter, harder, more independent is the exact reason you became mentally stronger than most people realize? Because the truth is, Gen X isn't emotionally distant or overly private or too self-reliant. You were shaped in an environment that quietly built resilience most people today are still trying to learn. And once you see it clearly, you'll never look at yourself or this generation the same way again. Number 1. You learned independence before you learned comfort. Research shows that early independence builds long-term problem-solving ability and emotional resilience. For Gen X, independence wasn't a choice, it was the default. You came home to empty houses, you made your own food, you figured things out without guidance, not because your parents didn't care, but because life required it. And while that may sound harsh to some people, here's what it actually did. It trained your brain to rely on itself. While others panic when something goes wrong, you assess, you adapt, you move. You don't freeze easily because you've been solving problems since you were a kid. That quiet independence people sometimes misunderstand as detachment is actually one of your greatest strengths. It means you don't need constant reassurance to function. You already trust yourself. Number 2. You developed emotional control, not emotional avoidance. Psychology shows that people raised in environments where emotions weren't constantly discussed often develop strong internal regulation systems. Gen X wasn't taught to openly process every feeling. There were no long conversations about emotions, no safe spaces for every reaction. So you learned something else. You learned how to sit with discomfort. You learned how to keep going, even when things felt uncertain. And while others might label that as bottling things up, what it often really is emotional discipline. You don't react to everything. You don't let every feeling control your behavior. You pause, you think, you move forward. And in a world where people are increasingly overwhelmed by their emotions, that kind of control is rare and powerful. Number 3, you became skeptical, not cynical. Research indicates that repeated exposure to broken promises or instability can create what psychologists call defensive thinking. But here's the difference. Cynicism says nothing works. Skepticism says prove it. Gen X grew up watching systems fail, institutions shift, promises break. So you stopped blindly trusting everything, but instead of giving up, you adapted. You learned to question things, to look deeper, to think critically. That's not negativity, that's awareness. And in today's world, where information is everywhere and not all of it is true, that ability to filter, question, and think independently is a massive advantage. Number 4, you value privacy because you understand exposure. Research shows that people who grew up without constant external observation tend to develop a stronger sense of internal identity. Gen X grew up in a time where not everything was documented. Mistakes weren't permanent. Embarrassing moments didn't live forever. And because of that, you developed a clear boundary between your public life and your private self. So when people today overshare everything online, it doesn't feel natural to you. Not because you're out of touch, but because you understand something deeply. Not everything needs to be seen to be real. Your privacy isn't a weakness, it's a form of self-respect. You choose what to share. You choose what matters. And that control protects your identity in a world that constantly tries to expose it. Number 5, you built quiet competence instead of loud validation. Psychology shows that intrinsic motivation, doing something for its own sake, is far more sustainable than external validation. Gen X wasn't raised on constant praise. You didn't get rewarded for every small effort.
You weren't told you were amazing just for showing up. So you learned to find value in the work itself. You show up, you do what needs to be done, and you don't need an audience to feel accomplished. While others chase recognition, you focus on results. And that's why, in many environments, you're the person people rely on the most. Not because you say the most, but because you deliver. Every time. And finally, number 6, you formed deeper loyalty through fewer connections.
Research suggests that people who grow up relying on peers rather than constant parental supervision often develop stronger, more meaningful friendships. Gen X didn't always have adults around, so your friends became your support system. You learned to trust each other, depend on each other, show up for each other. And that created something rare today: loyalty without performance. You don't need to constantly prove your connection. You don't need to broadcast your relationships. If you care about someone, they know. And if someone needs you, you're there, quietly, consistently, without making it about you. And maybe that's the most misunderstood thing about all of this, because from the outside, it can look like Gen X doesn't care. But the truth is, you just don't perform your care. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to display it. You live it. And that's why so much of who you are goes unnoticed. Not because it isn't valuable, but because it isn't loud. So if you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever felt like the world moved on to louder voices and bigger personalities, understand this: you weren't built for attention. You were built for stability, for resilience, for real-world strength that doesn't disappear when things get difficult. You're the generation that learned how to stand on your own, without applause, without constant support, without recognition. And instead of breaking you, it made you solid. So maybe you don't need to change who you are. Maybe the world just needs to understand it better. If this made you see yourself or someone in your life more clearly, subscribe for more psychology insights that help you understand the deeper patterns behind who we are.